I'm going to cover a lot of the same ground as Jonathan, but a certain amount of skidding in different directions will take place. At first sight, the aptness of Auden's September poem to the events of 2001 seems so obvious as almost to preclude comment. As Jonathan's pointed out, here we have in this poem New York, skyscrapers, evildoers, international wrong, and the eerie lines, the unmentionable odor of death offends the September night. On a pretty quick second glance, however, the connection seems so shallow as to make us wonder, so shallow and so casual, and indeed frivolous, to wonder how all those citations ever kept going for even for a few days. Just what exactly was the connection between Hitler's invasion of Poland and the terrorist attack on America in 2001? Had the 1990s been a low, dishonest decade full of clever hopes, or if there was a low, dishonest decade full of clever hopes, because that's what decades are like, did this have anything to do with the attacks at the beginning of the next decade? What was Luther's role in these recent horrors? Indeed, I'm not sure what Luther's role was in the initial horrors. I have no sense of what Luther is doing on September 1st, 1939, unless it's merely by being, his fault is to have been German. Was, for example, the lie of authority a big deal in September 2001? Even the eerie lines about the emotional odor of death are all wrong. The odor of death in 1939 in New York was entirely metaphorical. In 2001, it was not metaphorical, it was far from unmentionable. Everybody talked about it. People talked about little else except death in New York. It wasn't a night anyway, it was a morning, but that was another question. It's true, though, we may now get a little closer to the mystery and to what the stuff that Jonathan unpacked so beautifully. It's true that people mainly talked about the events of September 2001 to say how inexpressible they all were and how you couldn't talk about them. The main trope, there were two main tropes of that event, as many of you will remember. One is, what was I doing at the time? Usually something quite trivial. You know, I was busy, you know, washing up or doing something else, walking the dog, and there it was, and I wasn't even looking, I didn't know, and bang, it happened. And the other was, gosh, this is completely inexpressible, we cannot possibly talk about this. And I'll talk about it for another 10 or 15 minutes, expressing how inexpressible it is. This may actually afford us some kind of clue about what connects these two Septembers, or rather, what connects an old poem and recent history. So I'm going to throw two suggestions into our conversation, one which echoes Jonathan's and one's rather different. Just to recap, Stephen Bird has an article in 2003 called September 1, 1939 Revisited in American Literary History, where he rehearses all these things, and here's how he summarizes the situation. The poem seemed to, this is Stephen Bird, the poem seemed to prove that poetry and the powers poetry represents might still speak both to and for a broad group of readers, offering them a plausible, memorable interpretation of recent history. September 1st, this is still the quotation, September 1st, 1939 thus became again, an ideal typical example of the kind of poetic object academic readers now seek. It describes shared, urgent, clearly public concerns for a large body of people who demonstrably wanted to read it. You can tell from the syntax of that thing that Bert doesn't believe this. But he is describing a widespread perception that poetry represented these things. And I think John has already explained to some extent what the undercurrent of mystery is in this apparent acceptance of this manifestly in many ways completely irrelevant poem. In other words, to put that really crudely and romantically, every time we mentioned how unmentionable the horrors were, we were invoking, whether we knew it or not, our need for poetry. We didn't know we needed poetry until then. Poetry came out of the air to us. We recognized our need in the moment we recognized our silence. Mentioning the unmentionable, that's what poetry does. It doesn't just mention it, it honors it and it holds it at bay. It remembers and it grieves for whatever is lost in ordinary prose failed mentions of the unmentionable. This is why it is not barbaric to write poetry after Auschwitz. It's not even barbaric to write poetry about Auschwitz. This is my first suggestion, following on from Stephen Bird. And poetry, the sudden need for poetry was felt out of this, and I think for reasons which may be different from the ones Jonathan was saying, but I understand the ones Jonathan's saying. The ones I'm trying to track, I don't understand at all, but they're still there. So that's the first suggestion. And the two questions that arise for me, which I'll track through now. Number one, is it possible to write public poetry in an age so thoroughly devoted to the lyric? Public poetry, as distinct from personal poetry, mentioning unmentionable public events. Second question, if it is possible, did Auden write such a poem in the form of September 1st, 1939, or indeed ever? I don't know the answer to these questions in the larger aspects, and they may well need reformulating anyway. It's something we could happily talk about, I think. My second suggestion, though, is the limited response to the second question. It is that Auden, in September 1st, 1939, did not write anything resembling a public poem. The more one looks at it, the more private it gets. This doesn't make it less interesting, or indeed less relevant, but it alters the domain of its interest and its relevance. It withdraws it, I want to say, from any direct relation to recent violent history. As many people have noted, Auden's poem echoes Yeats's Easter 1916 in its form. Actually, the echoes are pretty slight. A three-beat stanza, a three-beat line and a long stanza. The actual stanza lengths are different, and the rhyme schemes are quite different. What is striking, though, is that both poems offer remarkably unpolitical reflections on deeply political events, and that both begin with a person in a city. The Yeats poem begins, you will remember, I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among grey 18th century houses. And the Auden poem begins, as you can see, I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid. Now for Yeats, a violent history, a recent violent local history, transfigures glamorous and vicious acquaintances alike. They are all transformed utterly. And it prompts him to what is effectively an not just an unpolitical question, but an anti-political question. Do we really want to have, as these political people do, hearts with one purpose alone? Do we want, the poem asks, hearts that are resistant to change and that resemble stones rather than birds, horses, or human riders, which are change all the time? Do we want to be the unchanging stone, or do we want to be the changing human or animal creatures? Yeats doesn't answer this question. He just returns to a historical rather than a political perception. A terrible beauty is born. A terrible beauty is born whether we like it or not, whether Yeats likes it or not. The Rising has altered the Irish and the English world irrevocably, and there it is. There is no moral point made here. There's a moral question asked, but the assertion itself is simply historical. Yeats then starts with himself and ends with history, effectively bracketing both the moral and the political. Auden starts with himself and ends with the company of the just, which may, with any luck, include him. He has more questions and worries than Yeats, and it soon becomes clear that there is a deep indirection in this poem, which paradoxically brings us back to 2001 and what's unmentionable. The immediate question seems to be for Auden, as for Yeats, what has happened? How did this happen? This, perhaps, is where the stanzas about Luther and Hitler and Thucydides take us, although they offer remarkably poor answers to, if they are answers to the question of what has happened, they are distinctly remote and sketchy answers. Similarly with the psychopathic God. But it might be, we might think this is in September 1939, this is a quick sketch of our time. Germany, tyranny, collective man. But at this point, we're less than halfway through the poem. We still have 5 stanzas to go. And these stanzas are all of them, not about the historical event and how it and why it happened, but about our shock at the event and every doubt and fear the event has awoken in us. It's all about us. As it were, Poland does not appear on the screen at this point. We are children of the night, we crave to be loved alone, we make false promises, we fail to understand the depths of our hunger and loneliness, even when we are all have the same loneliness. I thought of the Billy Joel song Piano Man, which, you know, the people who are drinking a drink they call loneliness, but it's better than drinking alone. This is what I always think of it as the critique of existentialism, but by the time we've got to these insights and this fear and this panic, it does feel, it's a little irreverent, I'm afraid, but it does feel as if Hitler's almost done us a favor. He's revealed the vast lies upon which we construct our lives. He's provoked moral awareness in it. No terrible beauty has been born, but there is a chance of some sort of moral awareness. We must love one another or die. Without Hitler, we wouldn't know that. There is absolutely no historical perception here that I can see, only a dream of justice and affirmation. History, even in the shape of the invasion of Poland, is a vast morality play in which we are all sinners. As Jonathan said, there were those who thought this way in September 2001, but they were indeed pilloried and threatened for even thinking that there was any kind of responsibility for that attack. And I think I like very much Jonathan's idea that the poetry allows us to acknowledge this without acknowledging it. There are pieces that we select pieces of the poem we want to hear, but we are hearing the other pieces of the poem. The question, I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this, is that's one structure. One structure is that we pick the pieces, we identify the pieces we want to hear. We also hear the pieces we don't want to hear, but we don't talk about them. That's one structure. The other structure would be we read in such a way we don't even hear or see the pieces we don't want to hear, and they've been sort of blanked out by our reading mind. These are two quite different models, I think, of reading. I don't know which is right, but they are interestingly different, I think. But certainly what is striking, this is, I disagree with Jonathan about the end of the poem, because in the end, I find the evasion of history in this poem, the reduction of the whole world and world history to, effectively to a moralizing mind on 52nd Street, seems to me very, very striking, and in a way not persuasive, but touching in its inadequacy, I think. That is, the end of the poem, to me, is desperately unconvincing. The affirming flame and the rest. I think flame and same rhyme with lame. But I do find it, I'm not saying, what I'm suggesting, I feel this about many poems, I'm not saying this makes it a bad poem, I'm saying that the pathos is not where it seems to be. The pathos, in other words, for me here is in the kind of lyrically touching failure to say what he would like to say. That is, what I hear in these last lines is not a hope or a prayer, even a prayer, but an already defeated fantasy. Jonathan also said, Auden dropped this poem from the work, and he said, we must love one another. It was false because we die anyway. But when a subtle and intelligent writer says something blunt and probably even silly, did he not know in 1939 that we die anyway? I mean, how did this escape his awareness? He must mean something else, is my assumption. And I think he was suggesting a rather more complicated thought. That is, he was thinking it, I'm just guessing, but he was thinking it and refusing to express it, or perhaps actually thinking it halfway and refusing to think the rest of it. The thought would be this. It would be a good thing to love one another if we could. It won't save us from dying in our mortal flesh, but it might save us from several forms of moral death. But it will not stop Hitler from invading Poland, and for two excellent reasons. The first, he's already done it. And the second is that Hitler doesn't care whether we love one another or not. Furthermore, our loving one another will not save Belgium or France or stave off the Blitz. Now, it seems to me the thought of love in this context is not actually dishonest. When Auden dropped the piece, he classified it among pieces he called dishonest or bad-mannered or boring. I mean, he dropped things according to all of these criteria. And dishonesty was this one. He said actually it was the most dishonest poem I've ever written. But I don't myself hear this as a dishonest poem. I hear this as, in a way, a peculiarly honest poem. Its attempt at grandeur is genuine, and its hope, at least, is also genuine. It's also, the condition expressed by the poem is precisely identified in the poem, I think, as the romantic lie in the brain. It's a poem about the romantic lie in the brain, not about being able to get rid of it. It's the romantic lie in the brain of the sensual man in the street. The same delusion, the delusion of loving one another or dying, or of some kind of moral redemption of a world which actually doesn't operate on moral principles, a kind of blunt, pragmatic, stupidly violent, actual world. The same delusion, I think, is expressed in what for me are the most wonderful lines in the poem about the children. That is, Hansel and Gretel, who they obviously are lost in that forest of history, who have never been happy or good. Never. It's almost impossible to think of children, or indeed anyone, who's never been happy or good. One or the other, surely. Never happy, fine. You know. Never good, also fine. But never happy or good. This is an extraordinary metaphysical condition. Right? And it looks forward to what, to me, some of Auden's most moving lines in the Shield of Achilles, where a child is described who, I quote now, who never heard of any world where promises were kept, or could weep because another wept. Never heard of any world where promises were kept, or could weep because another wept. This is a picture, it's in a bombed-out world that looks like sort of Berlin after the war or something like this. But it's very striking. See, I think we can all, I find this picture so powerful because I find it literally unimaginable. I know a lot of people don't keep their promises. And I can imagine even living in a world where no one keeps their promises. What I can't imagine is living in a world where I'd never heard of anybody keeping a promise. That seems to me such an extreme form of desolation that it takes the breath away. The point about this, I think, this is very powerful stuff, but it takes it out of history. So we can look for connections to reality, we can look for connections to our lives and our consciences. What we can't look for in this poem, I think, is any historical understanding whatsoever, because even this magnificent perspective of the desolate world where children were never happy, never good. In the end, that's so extreme that it can't really worry us. It's beyond any kind of concern. In such a world, we wouldn't have to decide anything. It wouldn't matter what we did. Never, in this context, sounds like a long time, but it isn't a time at all. Never doesn't have a date, and no dictator can cause it or invade it. Thank you.